being self is just
And we're live.
and we're live.
Hello.
And we're
Nice
live.
slope.
We're live. Mid slope, we're live. Hi.
Funny.
So here we are. This is episode 27. We took a little break, but we're back. So I'm here. I'm Todd, and I'm here with Kat and Joanne, and we are going to talk about navigating misinformation today, and specifically, when misinformation shows up in our worlds. That can be work, that can be home, that can be wherever, because there's no shortage of it. And it gets in the way. What's there? What is the curious leader's approach? And I didn't bring my bell, so I can't bring the bell for curious. But what is the curious leader's approach?
Yay! One of us remembered.
What is the curious leader's approach when faced with misinformation? So maybe I'll stop there. What's coming up for you two?
You know what hits me was the first time you said that was Trump. Like, it's just like, I'm sorry, I know we're staying in the corporate space, but I go, oh my gosh. That there's so, and it can cause such a rift in countries and stuff like that, right? All of that information. But if I get specifically, like, I stay away from all my friends and I hear them from the US and I feel for what they're going through. When I get specifically in corporations, when I start thinking about, like, for corporations, I start thinking about, like, how complex our organizations are right now and the speed at which they're working. And because of the speed that they're working, the fact that they don't spend the time to really align, because it's just so difficult for them to align. There's a lot of misinformation that's there, right? Misunderstanding, misinformation, and we're working with so many different people, right? That it becomes super complex, right? And hand me down, and the story, kind of changes as it goes. So that comes up for me, and it's a constant thing that I see when we're working with transformations, right? How the message kind of gets dropped, right? So from the vision and project or whatever down, but I think it happens a lot, and I think it's far worse than it used to be. Yeah.
Full stop. Yes.
I mean, everywhere it is, isn't it? Yeah. What about you, Kat? What do you think?
Two things. So first of all, let's define misinformation versus disinformation and what we actually mean to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. And then let me jump off from where Joanne just left off. So misinformation is unintentional untruths. And we're going to have to define that word truth as well, as we were talking about earlier on. It's going to be lots of definitions today. So misinformation is the unintentional untruths, like false information. And disinformation is the intentional spreading of falsities, or alternative facts, if we're going to go back to the Trump campaign. And the reality is all of us have the ability. And the reality is all of us do it at some point in time where we have some disinformation just because it serves our purposes. That's just human nature, to lie, basically. Obviously, the more we do it, the worse things get. And as mature adults, hopefully we know how to minimize the number of times that we lie. And when we also really think about what we're saying, that we're constantly questioning, is this really the whole truth? So jumping off from your point, Joanne, as to why it's increasing so much, I think as our world is very complex, sorry, my brain is kind of, let's blame it on the internet, that the internet is really slow. It's
also full of fake news.
Exactly. And the fake news is trying to shut us down now. Let's blame it on that and not the fact that my brain is only working at half speed. So in terms of why things increase, we're living in a much more complex world. We've got much more geopolitical conflict, which means there's intentional, this is duplication of words, but intentional disinformation by all sorts of players around the world.
Right.
to influence everybody else's elections. And now that we've got sort of the most elections around the world that we've ever had, with more people voting this year than ever before, obviously the intensity of disinformation on a political basis is going to increase. But there's also a whole bunch of industries that are under pressure, given environmental pressures and social justice pressures and other pressures. And of course, they're fighting back. And the reality is there's going to be disinformation and misinformation from, people who are trying to protect their turf, not just companies, but anybody. So I think as we get into this more volatile, complex, basically scary world, there's going to be more misinformation and disinformation. And one thing that we talked about, or one question that we sort of wanted to raise was, why is it that so many people are willing to believe misinformation or disinformation knowingly? Yeah. And I think that's sort of a follow-up question to what Joanne was saying.
Yeah. Well, isn't that interesting? Because when things are moving so quickly, what's that acronym? I don't like it, but people use it all the time. VUCA.
VUCA.
Oh yeah.
Volatile, uncertain, complex, and
Certainty,
ambiguous.
Thank you.
ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we're living in I just don't like it because it's not a word, but whatever.
Yes, it is to some people.
If we're living in a VUCA world, which we are,
Yeah.
and it's becoming increasingly more so, right? The desire for answers becomes greater as well. And I think what's really interesting about that is we've talked about sort of the importance of connection. We've talked about the importance of building relationship. We've talked about, sort of how all of those things connect with respect to building my own self-trust, my own self-efficacy. And it seems to me that the more disconnected I am, the more susceptible I shall be to disinformation and misinformation. Because the structures, not just of self-efficacy and self-trust, but the structures of relationship and community will be weaker. I feel like I'm getting really, really sort of theoretical, but
no, I don't. I think that's really critical, and I would layer one more piece onto that. So when I work with clients, I basically say we need to address how they think, because what we're not taught in business school or taught anywhere else is how to understand complexity. We're taught how to recognize problems, but basically we're not understanding them, and therefore we're actually trying to solve the wrong problems. And then if we use best practices on top of that, so using best practices which are flawed to start with, on top of recognized problems which we actually don't understand, we're basically creating more problems. But that's how we're taught. So if you layer on the fact that people don't know how to think properly, what you're talking about is they don't know how to feel and use their emotions as information. They're just trying to suppress their emotions, which is basically what emotional intelligence has become. It's not what it was intended to be. And then we have to learn how to act differently. So think, feel, act differently. And acting differently means learning how to experiment and being comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. Yeah. So you're addressing one of the parts of the three parts that I usually work with clients.
Being, well, I don't want to use the word comfortable, but, sort of accepting that there is an element of uncertainty and knowing how to be with that uncertainty, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Rather than sort of grasping at answers, right? It's someone said to me today, because I've been thinking about anxiety a lot again, and someone said to me, I used to think, someone said, I agreed, I used to think that the antidote to anxiety was certainty, but in fact it's self-trust. And it's
I love that.
different. Because there's a paradox.
I think self-efficacy is actually the antidote to anxiety, because self-efficacy includes trust, but it's also that exploration, that experimentation. Yeah, that's what self-efficacy means to me. It's defined a bit differently by different people.
Well, there's perhaps an element of curiosity in there too.
Huge. Yeah. Ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell.
Oh yeah, hold on.
Yay.
Better, even better.
It was interesting so one of the things, and you just, I don't know if it was how it relates to this or not, but I think it does in a way. What you're saying, Todd, earlier was people listening to the news to feel connected to something, like connected to
Mhm.
what's going on around them and everything else. And of course, like for example, I mean, there's been a whole trend of not listening or believing the news anymore, right? Like
Mhm.
it's just a sort of like a drama. It's just another drama. It's not really. It's just like they're just trying to get you all like up here or down there, whatever the case may be.
Selling
But
advertisement.
Mhm.
yeah. So
That's what it's
but the
about.
one yeah, the one thing that shocked me was my mother actually. So and about the news, right? Because I would sit there and say to her, because it gets her so anxious and gets her so upset,
Mhm.
and I tell her to stop watching it. But she was brought up in World War II. The only way that they could hear that the Germans were going to bomb UK
Mhm.
was through the news.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So she goes, if I don't do it through the news, I'm not going to know
Mhm.
when something is imminent, right?
Mhm.
So I guess that like there's this sort of like yeah, I know it's sort of like not great. Like I think there's this I don't know if I would say it's an unconscious bias, right? But it's just the habits that one has created over a lifetime, right?
Mhm.
To kind of connect to the news, to believe in the news, to believe everything it said, because we've always had a history to believe in it, right?
Well,
Mhm.
news
Um,
used to be good.
yes,
News
yeah,
used to be more comprehensive, more balanced. I don't know if it really was balanced. I'm sure there's a lot of people that could legitimately argue against that, but
yeah,
there was much more effort to provide information. While now it's a matter of it's basically clickbait. If we're talking about TV news or radio news, it's clickbait. It's the equivalent of clickbait. It's just yeah, and the way that our social media gives us the dopamine hits, the way that people are addicted to that. We're also there's other people like your mom and other people, and I used to be one of these people, addicted to the news and the emotional jolts I would get from that.
Mhm.
right. Oh, the dopamine aspect too.
Yeah.
And I think this, but back to your point, Katerina, like the changing the way that we see it, right? The way that we're thinking about what it is, right?
Hmm.
Um, it can be hard with some people to rethink it, or I mean, at my mother's age, unfortunately, it's a little bit more challenging at
Hmm.
90, but for some, they can be perfectly open to that kind of change. And this is what we see a lot in corporations too,
Hmm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, so like I start to go in terms of when we look at the news which is coming from the outside world, how does that reflect inside our corporations? Like, is there similar things inside our corporations, right?
Ooh, because there's two things that come up when I think of that. The first is sort of how the misinformation or disinformation impacts the people on the team, because we talked about this, there's an emotional response that
Hmm.
goes along with that, right? Whether it's good or bad or whatever, right? Like there's something that happens. So consuming that content, because that's the word that they use now, right? They don't make news, they make
Hmm.
content.
Mhm.
Is has an impact. But I think what's more insidious, um, and this is what's interesting to me, is how that paradigm has from time to time been co-opted within the context internally of an organization. So what I mean by that is I'm not going to name names because I'm not going to name names, but Corporation X, says we need to, lay off 10% of our workforce because reasons, whatever, and then they go ahead and lay off 10% of the workforce, and
Which ends
then
up costing the company more money in the long term, but it gives the CEO and the executive team a huge bonus.
it does. And moments later, they will release a press release that says, you know, corporate profits are way up and our dividends are
Hmm.
up and the shareholders are super happy, or whatever it
Hmm.
is, right? So there is the only way to consume those two pieces of information
Hmm.
is like, if it was a movie, I would say I must suspend my disbelief, which is the same thing that I need to do when I'm watching science fiction, because there are no rocket ships that we can take into outer space like in Star Trek or something. Um, but it's not a movie. It's not a piece of fiction, and suspension of disbelief within that context, I think, sort of walks a very thin line along cognitive dissonance.
Mm.
Like, I understand and I accept that sometimes we need to hold a paradox, and this isn't a paradox.
Well,
This
I
is,
think
like,
this
there's a
comes
lot.
back to the thinking piece, and it comes back to the conversation of truth that we had before we started the call.
Mm.
So I think, Todd, you had asked before we started this conversation, is there a single truth? And when I was doing my PhD, we did a bunch of philosophy stuff, which is kind of required, and it's good, but it was a bit tedious. But the idea is there's some camps, some philosophical approaches where there basically is believed there is a single truth.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that's my brain is done today. I'm sorry. And my camera is reflecting it full stop. So there's the positivists in the scientific world who basically believe there's a single truth. And then there's the constructivists, and there's other camps as well. But generally, these are the two opposing sides, where the constructivists believe that everybody's got different experiences, therefore there is no truth, no single truth. Each of us have a different perspective of the truth. And the positivists would argue and say, well, the truth is somewhere between that, the real truth, right? But the point is, I think too many of us believe that there is a single truth, and we kind of oversimplify that. And we're not able to hold these paradoxes, to use your word, conflicting truths at the same time. And we're also not able to recognize that most people are trying to do the best they can with what they've got, with how they understand things, with how they see things. So it's not that when somebody was presenting their truth and we don't agree with it, it's not necessarily that they're lying. It's just it's a different perspective, right? So we have to really understand not only that what my truth and your truth is going to be might be different, but we also have to really think about, why do we have a different truth? Why is it that I see the world the way I do and you see it the world the way that you do? Yeah, and we're not taught how to do that. We're not taught how to understand complexity. We're not taught how to really think about what are people's motivations for what they're doing and saying, right? And with CEOs and the executive teams who are laying off 10,000 people in one go and then getting huge bonuses, they're just playing the system. Like, why would they do it any differently? So
Right.
for us to expect that under the current rules that we operate under, to say that they shouldn't do that is really naive, right? Like, we really have to recognize, if we want people to behave in a certain way, then we have to incentivize them in the right way. Incentivizing, unfortunately, CEOs have been incentivized by short-term money. And what we need to do is change that structure, to use
So
that example.
well, isn't that interesting? Because what that seems to say to me is that misinformation and disinformation, whichever one, pick one, is a symptom of, like, a structural problem or a systemic problem.
And how we operate in it. The fact that we're not able to understand. Yeah, we're all taught to believe, even in business school, even in my executive MBA program, we never dealt with complexity. We never dealt with competing truths. Yeah, so we're just not taught how to do that. And basically, we learned the golden rule: whoever has the gold makes the rules.
Hmm.
Well, and if you're in the religious families and stuff like that, we were
Yeah.
brought up by certain rules, right? And so so that these were essentially the truths, right? So it's sort of like our culture has that, like, when we're younger and at the earlier stages of our life, we have to there is this need to kind of like understand, nope, you can't, that the the boundaries that one can
Mhm.
operate in at a certain age, and over our stages of development we can start opening up and seeing more and more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's different stages of development which allow us to see that there's like basically 2% truth in everything that's being said,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mhm.
But it requires that level of you have to be at that level of the psychological development,
Mm-hmm.
but to be there you've had
And
to
and intellectual development too.
yeah, And
Mm.
the thing is, what happens is to get there is usually through the like, hard ass hit, right? You've got
Right.
hit by something, you got
Mhm.
caught in the act, like something else has happened, you didn't realize, when that's faced, to you, then at that point in time you go, oh,
Yeah.
there was another story I
Mhm.
didn't know was
Well,
there.
well, and I think it's interesting because I think Bruno brought up a really, really interesting point in the
Yeah.
chat, and I'm going to bring it up here.
Yeah, thanks.
Because I think that what you're getting at is like who benefits from the right from whatever the story happens to be,
Mhm.
and this is a really, really interesting take. Finding the line and wondering where it is, like take a look at the two competing sides, if you can even find the two competing sides.
Assuming
it's
there's
it's
only two.
really well, or three or six or 10 or 1,000.
Yeah.
Right, like there's something really interesting in that it's sort of like to discover or to hold the paradox. We need to sort of make room for all of it.
Mhm.
And the challenge that I have, and I'll just sort of declare this, the challenge that I have is making room for misinformation or making room for disinformation. And of course, the thing is well, what is misinformation, disinformation?
Mhm.
If the only perspective that I have to evaluate it is my own, and it is, unless of course I
And
have
if you
really
layer
good.
on the fact that if you're scared or angry or feeling like the world is unfair,
Mhm.
then if somebody gives you misinformation that feels right because of your emotional
Mhm.
state, even if you know that it's wrong, just because it serves your emotional needs, which is perfectly okay, right? We need to take care of our emotions. That's not the right way to do it. But the reality
Mhm.
is that's a very logical way for people to do that. So we have
Confirmation
to
bias is a
recognize,
really, really strong
this
point.
weaponizing of misinformation that Bruno's getting at is, when people are providing disinformation, they're giving it to people who they know are fertile ground to
Right.
spread their disinformation as misinformation because it
Mm.
feels good to the people who are hearing it.
Hmm. So so back to the question, like, so here I am, I'm a curious leader, and this is the landscape that I find myself in. And now what?
I
Because
like the comment.
that's
Well, I
sorry, what's
think
that?
pull up the comment, hence the importance of a rich
Oh,
life
from
and
June?
people
Hang on.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's very, very true, June. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oof.
I
Wow, we.
I I think a lot of times what I tend to like to do is drop assumptions that people like I have about whether or not it's right or it's wrong or anything like that, and just look at what everyone's saying and be curious about what may not be there. Be curious about the missing stuff. Be curious to kind of open up. What else do we need to know? What else do we need to learn? But be very non-judgmental about the right or the wrong, or yeah, it could be true. I don't know. Maybe or maybe not. Let's look at some other perspectives to
Mhm.
understand, right? Because there's,
Mhm.
like you're saying, Kat, there's many perspectives that
Mhm.
anyone ha, there's many perspectives of one truth, right? Everyone has a different perspective, right? So, and it helps them personally, and
Mhm.
so basically to understand, my whole thing is always open to understanding what's really here at this particular moment, being curious and
Mhm.
not judging one is right or one is wrong, knowing that there isn't one single truth.
Yeah.
If we go back to the definition of curiosity, the definition from the academic world that I really like is organizing what we believe to be true now and mapping that out. And there's different ways of mapping it. It could be everything from supply chain approaches to chronological to there's many, many different ways that I do it with my clients. But the key thing is just map out what you believe to be true. What's the actual process of that? Or how do the pieces fit together?
Mhm.
And then where are the gaps? What am I missing? And of course, we're going to have blind spots. But as we keep doing this to figure out what do I believe to be true, and if we actually map it out physically, all of a sudden it becomes clear that I actually don't know anything about this area, right? So it really starts becoming clear where we have gaps. And then we go out and we kind of look for information to fill in those gaps or to help us understand the contradictions that we're identifying or whatever it is. And then we go back and say, now how do I understand the truth? And this is going to June's comment, which is the rich life is the more experience we have and the more we do something with the experience. Like simply having an experience isn't enough. We have to then reflect on that experience, interpret it, put it into our map, figure out, do we need to change our map, or does it actually fit our current model that we're using? But that's sort of this iterative process throughout our lives. And then if somebody gives us their opinion on something or their thoughts on something, then we can determine if we believe it to be misinformation or disinformation, doesn't matter. And then it gives us a chance to say, well, here's why I don't get it, I don't understand it. And maybe our gut reaction is, I don't trust that, I don't believe it's true. But that's where we have to then be curious and say, why does that person believe that? And sometimes they believe it because they really have a different perspective. And sometimes they realize they feel that way because they really have some emotional need to believe something that is truly untrue. Yeah. But either way, there's a reason that people hold those beliefs. And we have to be able to understand why.
Well, it's interesting for me is when you're saying this is that we have our own assumptions
Yeah.
of why this thing is true, right?
Yeah.
So when someone comes up and they present some other piece of information,
Yeah.
I'm quick to kind of relook at my assumptions. Oh, well, I was assuming it was this. Maybe I had the wrong assumption here. What's your assumption? And that seems to like doesn't detonate because I thought it would, like I'm bringing up my assumptions for that specific fake that misinformation, and that seems to open up the conversation to allow for, okay, what's your assumption, and then to be able to get more aligned across two people.
I love that, and there's an underlying assumption of honesty within that context, right? And I think that the like it just the more as we talk about this, the thing that like the fly in the ointment or the sand in the clam, which isn't making a pearl at this point. Like I don't know what the metaphor is, but it's like the irritant at this point is intent to deceive. And
but then the question
almost,
is why? Like, why does somebody feel the need to deceive?
right.
Yeah. And that may tell us something about the circumstance that we're trying to understand, or it might tell us about the person.
Well, and I mean, to not to, and I'm sorry, Bruno, not to reduce, sort of the rich idea that you had to a, like to a saying or a cliche, but I mean, follow money, right? Like what does, like where is the benefit and what is the benefit likely to be within the context of intent to receive? But it's like, what's coming up for me as we think about this, like it's been a half an hour already and look at where we are, is that this is a complex structure and that there's an awful lot of opportunities to fail and to have to get back up and to try again and to fail again. And there's an element, like the word experiment keeps popping up into my head as being a really, really important aspect here. And I think maybe that's my takeaway.
Think, feel, and act.
Well, yeah, and also screw up because you're gonna. Because,
well, that's the acting, is the experimenting.
Well, and also and it's okay if you do, because sure, maybe that's not what misinformation
it's
is.
not even okay.
It's disinformation.
We need it. We need to screw up so we can understand. Right. Yeah, if we're always right, it doesn't. We're not learning anything.
Right. If we're always right, we're not learning anything. Yeah.
This is all part of the system, right? It's all part of showing you what's in the system. So the misinformation, the deceiving, like all that, I don't know if it's necessary to fix any of it. It's just to be able to recognize that it's happening, right? And then to be able to sit there and figure out, then what do you want to do with that? You may not be able to fix the deceiver. You may not understand why that person is doing the deceiving. You need to figure out yourself how you're going to work in that circumstance, right? Because there's just us trying to fix other people. Sorry.
No, we need to fix systems that create the people who are deceitful, right? And
well, yeah,
that's not just a matter of laws. It's a matter of why are there so many people who are so damaged that end up being so deceitful. Like if you look at Trump, Hitler, Saddam Hussein, all of them, Putin, they all have extremely well documented serious abuse in their childhood, like serious abuse. Yeah, that's not coincidental.
Yeah.
So, we can't fix Trump, we can't stop Trump, but what we can do is change the system. Yeah.
I I think we need a whole different half hour. June has a really cool comment in here, so I'd like can we bring that up before we sign off. I know we're a little over time, but let's take a look at this. Oh, I can.
Yeah.
So
Sorry.
let's leave it for a second. Literally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've got to play
that's
now.
Really interesting. I know.
I this is why I like doing conversations about the heart-to-heart conversations. This is precisely why I'm doing heart-to-heart conversations, because those conversations are not actually happening within the workspace, and it needs to be happening in the workspace.
Yeah.
So if we can teach more leaders on how to have more compassionate conversations, right, then that would be better. But I feel that sometimes the leaders are just so impacted with so many things that are on the plate of doing, less money, less team, less everything, that we're not creating the space that's required to create these great, rich conversations that are so needed, right? And so it's the system that's not allowing this to happen, but something's going to break. Absolutely. If we don't start listening.
It's not going to. It already is.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and perhaps that's what we're seeing with the rise of misinformation, disinformation is as a result of that. So it'll be interesting to see how we navigate the sort of this crescendo, because there's more and it's getting louder. Exactly. Any last words? Yeah. This was a hard one, wasn't it? This was a hard one.
Well, I think what my whole thing is just realize that there's a 2% truth in what everyone is saying. That's it.
Yeah.
But there is, and and we have a lot of choices. It's not just a matter of feeling victimized. We have a lot more choices. Yes,
I like that. And sometimes that choice is you don't have to put up with it. Sometimes walking away from it is the right choice. We have that choice too.
Nice.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much, both of you. I really love
Thank you.
I missed these. I can't believe it's been so long. But thank you. And I guess we are on again, not
May 14th
week, but the week after, May 14th. Okay, awesome. So I'll see you about that. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, June.
Yeah.
And all those who are listening afterwards.
Yep.
Thank you.